going to now move on to discussing the politics of global capital. Kicking off our discussion will be Mr. UK Sinha, the chairman of SEBI. But before he gets up to deliver the first keynote for the day, I thought I'd introduce the rest of the panel to you. At the extreme sort of far end, we have Rohinton Medhora, who is the president of the Center for International Governance Innovation. There seems to be this theme of innovation happening throughout the day. Next to him is Wencai Zhang, who is the vice president at the Asian Development Bank. And then we have Diplock, who is the deputy chairman of the International Integrated Reporting Council and a highly respected and senior regulator. So, Mr. Sinha, without spending much time, I'll invite you to deliver the first keynote for the day.
Good morning, everybody. I find that the topic about politics of global capital is a very interesting topic. Finance is a great power play. Even in the domestic context, it's a power play. But when we go to the international context, it is a power play which goes up exponentially. Ever since we can have a record of the history, we find that always international finance has been dictated by the powerful. At times, the laws and rules have been written by those who have won wars or under threat of any military action. And at some times, when we see that in a peacetime, a geography or a series of jurisdictions start gaining into their economic power, and they demand a change in the power play. Institutions and arrangements which were created post the Second World War are getting challenged again and again in a very serious and systemic way. But whether we have been able to move forward as per the requirements and the realities of the modern world is a question which all of us need to address. However, there are feelings, especially in emerging markets and developing markets, that the realities of the current world are not being recognized. And that is one of the reasons why the demands for changes in these institutions have become more and more vocal, and when those demands are not being met, alternatives are being looked at. The creation of NDB and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank are very, very significant developments. For years together, IMF reforms have been talked about without much of a success. So in sheer frustration, if nothing else, alternate institutions are being created, alternate boundaries are being drawn. And the aspirations of the people of emerging and developing market economies have to be met in some way or the other. And perhaps this is a good beginning, but a very significant beginning. Another point I would like to highlight is that post the global financial crisis, we saw that in international regulatory bodies, certain extra voice was given to emerging markets, which they didn't have earlier. For example, the Financial Stability Forum was changed into Financial Stability Board, and countries like China, India, Brazil got a seat there. In IOSCO, the executive committee was reconstituted, and these countries got a seat. So while we have got a seat on the main table, it has given us an opportunity of being heard, and there are several instances where these voices are being heard. But I still doubt how effective our voices have become there. Just to give you a few examples, the global financial crisis was not created by any of the emerging markets, but they suffered. And one of the reasons for the developments which took place was the over-the-counter derivatives, the OTC derivatives. There has been a consistent demand in IOSCO and also in FSB for changes in the OTC derivative trading patterns. There have been some policy level engagement and agreement that yes, this is a good demand, it should be met. But unfortunately, we have not moved much on this. So while we are being heard, whether we have been effective, I have my doubts. Similarly, I'll give you another example of money market funds. Money market funds were one of the main reasons why there were extreme volatility at the time of the global financial crisis. All over the world, including India, we have what we call the net asset value-based money market funds. But instead of that, there is a large country which has this system of having a fixed NAV, and that was the root of serious volatility and disturbance. It has taken IOSCO more than 5-6 years to even come to a conclusion that this rule will be changed. In global standard setting, for example, the new rules about capital for banks, in my mind, it has been guided by the philosophy of one size fits all. What about the problems of the emerging markets, where there are huge requirements for investments, particularly in infrastructure? How do we meet that if we have to have the same capital requirements, and resulting thereby, either the deposit rates have to be reduced, the cost of employees have to be reduced, or the cost of lending has to go up. So these are some of the developments which come to my mind post the global financial crisis, where while dialogues have started taking place, which is a welcome development, but whether we have a meaningful say in the final outcome, I think we have a lot of ground to cover. Another thing which comes to my mind is the fair and effective market review. This review took place with IOSCO and FSB in 2015. Some basic principles were highlighted there, but again, a lot of ground has to be covered. So the point I'm trying to highlight here is that there has been some progress post-global financial crisis. Maybe more and more discussions are taking place where voices of other countries are also being heard, but effectiveness has not yet come. Maybe it will take some more time. Another development which I would like to highlight here is that in their enthusiasm to take action post the global financial crisis, some national and regional bodies have come out with legislations or enactments which have serious elements of extraterritoriality. They are applicable not only for them or the jurisdictions that they cover, but also outside their jurisdiction, and they have a force of law. I'll give you an example of European Market Infrastructure Regulation, EMIR regulation, where one of the requirement is that any bank or institutions which is registered in the euro area, and if they want to do clearing in an entity outside the European zone, then that clearing corporation, that clearing entity has to be registered with EMIR. Whether that clearing entity is following the guidelines which are prevalent as per the global standards which have been set by IOSCO or FSB, for example, is in this case not applicable. You have to undergo a separate process of validation by the European authorities. It has led to serious problems. We have been talking to them. I think almost all the emerging markets have been talking to them. Some temporary solutions have been brought about. But the question is, and it's the basic question, that do we get guided, are we guided by global standards which have been mutually accepted and agreed upon, or can national guidelines or regional guidelines can have a higher play and one has to succumb oneself to those things? This is the power play. I give you the example of EMIR. There is another example of CFTC, which came out with its own guidelines about settlement of commodity derivatives. And there has been problems with the emerging markets dealing with it, and certain dialogues have again come to some temporary solutions. So we have to consider and look at whether as a global community, we are going for a global standard setting which will be followed by everybody, or will there be over and above a regional or national standard which will be superimposed? Another area which is very significant in this point is the element of reciprocity. Should there be an element of reciprocity or not? Can one country impose its will over others without caring for reciprocity? Unfortunately, the current situation is that we have examples where reciprocity is not being followed. Another area I would like to highlight is in the area of taxation and anti-money laundering. These are areas where, for example, Financial Action Task Force is there, and those who are members and signatories to Financial Action Task Force have to follow certain common guidelines. But we are seeing examples of superior or alternate efforts being made to attract corporations to a particular jurisdiction. And there are corporations who are doing it. There are jurisdictions who are doing it. So how to come out with a predictable regime on global taxation is something which is again not being guided by fair play, but where there are a number of other developments or power play which is acting. And in some of these cases, the effort is not towards tax avoidance only, but it is also towards tax evasion. So it is now becoming a global question that how this type of an initiative is handled in a combined way and in a common way. So far as trade is concerned, again we are seeing that the regional treaties that are being drawn upon are primarily guided by the consideration of who is in a superior position to do that or impose that, rather than by looking into the aspirations of people of vast countries where there are significant populations residing and their fate is concerned with those trade things. Another area I would like to mention here is the area where, because of the advantage of having reserve money, certain jurisdictions are having advantage with regard to, for example, where the central banks will park their money. They are having advantage in where the sovereign wealth funds will park their money. So what about the requirement of money or funds which are there in the emerging markets, for example, in areas of infrastructure? What do we do about that? So these are the questions which need to be deliberated, and some path has to be looked at, and some forward-looking thinking has to be there. I'm reminded, and I think in the earlier session you had a session on Asian cooperation. I'm reminded that at least since 2003, there was a serious attempt to create an Asian bond market. Certain jurisdiction in Asia took a lot of interest in that, but we must blame ourselves that we could not move forward. There were some political or diplomatic issues, and because of that, the savings of the entire Asia is going into some other jurisdictions, and the requirements of Asia are not being met. So I would like to end by saying that the emerging markets, the developing markets have to come together and look at areas of cooperation whereby they can jointly take care of the requirements of funds and capital of each other. If we are able to do that, we will be changing the face of this earth. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Perfect. Perfect. No, perfect. Well, thank you, Mr. Sinha. Thomas Jefferson said that financial institutions are a bigger fear for liberty than standing armies. So we're going to explore more about the politics of global capital, because capital, frankly, chases returns, but capital is also required for economic activity. The world is getting more integrated. and therefore we're seeing a larger role, as Mr. Sinha also mentioned, of politics impacting the way flows happen. Raj Rishi Singhal of Gateway House has written an interesting article on this topic in the book, so have a look at it later. And we're seeing new players come in, which Mr. Sinha also talked about, to address some of the challenges left by the historic players. So he talked about the regulatory challenges and responses in recent times. So now we're going to step back, and I'm going to ask Rohinton first to give us a historical perspective about some of these challenges, because quite often we forget that there's a good lesson to be learned from history. Then Jane's going to talk about the element of trust in building up this infrastructure and in flows of capital. And then Wencai is going to talk about the capital flows that have been taking place around and what some of the challenges are. So, Rohinton, you'll have to pick up the...
Louis, thank you. I agree with you that history and politics go together. And in the case of international finance, the politics are determined by the history, and the history in this case is the politics of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. So here was a conference of many countries in the world, but not all, in which, in fact, developing countries were quite well represented. One of the unknown facts about the Bretton Woods Conference, which my colleague Eric Heliner has written on recently, is that many Latin American countries sent delegations. China sent a very strong and articulate delegation. India sent a delegation of 8 officials. 4 were British, but 4 were Indians. But at Bretton Woods, the real debate was between the US and the UK. And by this time, it was clear that the US was the dominant economic power in the world. And so those of you who know that period would know that there was a strong intellectual debate between the UK negotiator Keynes and the American negotiator White. But that debate was flavored by the US versus UK rivalry, which had also begun asserting itself at the time. UK was skeptical about freer and freer trade, while the US, in fact, thought that this was a good thing. That's one thing to keep in mind. The second is that this was still a time when capital mobility was quite limited. And so the institutions that we now have and the issues that Secretary Sinha referred to are a throwback to a time when capital mobility was not as strong, but in fact it was trade that was the dominant feature, which the UK was resisting. And that's why we came out of Bretton Woods with 2.5 institutions. The half was the fact that what we now know as the WTO was not created until about 1993-94, but the IMF and the World Bank were. The Indian delegation made a strong pitch that the articles of the IMF include development considerations. Both the US and the UK resisted that. And so one reason we have this quite strong dichotomy between balance of payment adjustment, almost divorced from some of the realities of developing countries, is because of this sense that monetary stability and development had to be taken care of by 2 separate institutions. The US gave in to the UK skepticism about freer trade by agreeing that instead of having a full-fledged institution overseeing free trade, we would simply have an agreement, the GATT, which would oversee bits and pieces of freer trade. And then the US got its way in return on the IMF, in which the White Plan was much less far-reaching than the Keynes Plan. Keynes and the UK saw the IMF as being the lender of last resort, as being the world's central bank. And that is something that the US was resisting for many reasons, one of which in fact you referred to, is that the US wanted the US dollar to be the hegemonic currency and not have an artificial unit, which Keynes called the Bancor, come into effect. This is all important because today when we think of the gaps in financial governance, what might the 2 or 3 big ones be? One is something that, especially in this region, and since '97, that the IMF has been consistently criticized for, rightly or wrongly, but criticized for, which is that the burden of adjustment falls on debtor countries and not on creditor countries. That goes back to the way the IMF was constructed in 1944 and the vision that the US had for the IMF as being not a lender of last resort, but of overseeing adjustment. The second gap that we face and that we're seeing in spades in Europe is the lack of a global sovereign debt resolution mechanism. Sovereign debt resolution was a byline in the IMF Accords. Overseeing financial regulation was a byline in the IMF Accords. And so we still don't have a systematic way for countries to unwind the way companies can unwind through national legislation. We don't have a global Chapter 11. We're still seeking one. In fact, my organization has one or two proposals that we've made public about how we might go about doing it. But the fact is we don't have institutions capable of doing that. And the final point I'd make is that we're now that we have 3 organizations, we have 3.5, but we don't have 4. We now recognize that financial stability and macroeconomic stability go hand in hand. But we don't have the organization in the FSB. It is not treaty-based. It is not as inclusive as it can be. Basel II and Basel III are essentially still rich country accords where the needs of emerging markets have not been fully implemented. As a result, the 4th pillar, as some people now call it, of global financial stability, the FSB as a treaty-based organization doesn't exist. And that is the history that brings us to where we are.
Thanks, Rohinton, for that perspective as we see sort of new institutions, et cetera, come up and the debate carry on. Jane.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Gateway House and thank you to the Government of India for this invitation. I'm truly honored to be on such an illustrious panel. I'd like to talk about 3 things. I'd like to firstly touch on trust and trust in markets. I'd like to then talk a little bit about financial stability and global regulation. And then I'd like to talk about what business might do to solve some of the questions that remain in relation to trust. But firstly, let me just touch on something that Chairman Sinha said. He said that in international arrangements, the rules are usually written by the winners. And I think perhaps at the moment we're seeing a very different sort of war going on. It's a war for capital, and it's a war around the world. And I wonder who will be the winners. And I suspect it might not be those who won after the Second World War, but an entirely different set of emerging market countries. So the question is, will the new rules for global regulation, and should they, not be written by those winners? And I'll put that as a question to you in the audience. But if we look at the question of trust, I guess I'm with Curtis in the first panel. I'm an optimist. I'm very positive about the global capital markets in the next decade. And despite those who want to build walls and dystopian forecasts about existential threats that are going to wipe us off the face of the earth, I don't believe those. But I do think that there is a breach of trust between the producers and distributors of capital and those who are actually the true beneficiaries of global capitalism, and that is the taxpayers and the people of the countries in which we all, the global markets function. And that trust has probably been most easily accessibly described in a Bank of England recent survey. The Bank of England had an open forum, and they asked 2 sets of participants. One were the usual suspects, the people that they always talk to as their stakeholders. And the others were a wide section of civil society. And they asked them, what do you think the future of a financial, of international finance will be. And it's interesting. The participants, the market participants, used a very perhaps predictable set of words to describe finance going forward: regulated, accountable, important, and volatile. The second group also used important and volatile, but perhaps most tellingly, the words they most often used were corrupt, greedy, and unstable. And I don't think that the Bank of England was particularly delighted with this outcome, but it's very clear that there has been a breakdown in the social contract between business and the stakeholders of business. And it's time for finance and business more generally to convince the wider society of the positive role it plays and its purpose in society and its contribution to more than the narrow interests of its shareholders and executives. They're important, and the providers of financial capital are undoubtedly important, but so are other stakeholders, and I think increasingly we're seeing an interest in businesses articulating much more clearly how their business and their business model adds value over the short, medium, and long term, not only in US GAAP terms or IFRS terms, but also in non-financial terms. And the challenge in this is to articulate that in a concise way, in a report that is not like all the tedious annual reports I had to read as a regulator, some 400 pages of incomprehensible numbers and figures, but in a narrative which explains whether your business is sustainable. But this lack of confidence, ladies and gentlemen, is not limited to banks. It extends far more widely, not only to big business, to governments, central bankers, and politicians. I think there's a strong need to rebuild public trust. The second thing I wanted to...
Could we come back to the other ones later as we sort of go on? Because I think the trust part which you've talked about has been very important as we sort of move on to stuff which we'll discuss at the panel. But Wencai, would you like to talk about capital flow sitting where you are at the ADB?
Okay, thank you, Luis. As a development banker, certainly we want to see how we make sure the capital flow, really are very orderly way. We don't want to see that, particularly for those days we see the many, short-term speculative capital that have caused a lot of, challenge particularly for the emerging economies. So we see that, recent years, capital flow has been here for many years. But we see that the capital used to come from the developing economy to the emerging and developing economy. But now we see that capital also come from the from south to the north, and particularly emerging country, right? They have more and more overseas investment in these days. So you see that even they go abroad for the merger, acquisition, big project, there. So in the recent days, so I think this is a very positive trend for the global capital flow. But at the same time, we also see challenges I mentioned about the volatility of capital flow, right? Particularly for those short-term speculative capital flow. And also we see more integrate trade investment efforts here, but also we see some increasing protectionism, trade protection and the investment protection also. Even many countries, many regions are trying to do this regional bilateral trade investment agreement. And also the Doha round are still there. They try to make progress on that. But still we see that kind of protectionism coming to us. And so I see that we have to look at at the global level, regional level, and the country level, country to country level, how we manage this capital flow. I don't see that a very effective global mechanism here to manage this capital flow. We had a lot of debate after crisis, right, in the G20, about global financial regulations. IMF, also trying to address the issues. So even recently, think about how they advise the developing country, right, for the capital account liberalization issue. There's a debate, whether that the country that should do that in a more cautious way, right, a more gradual way, not just to open the capital market, right, immediately if the conditions are not there. So, and many things also at a regional level, like regional safeguard, mechanism there, like Chinmay and other European financial stability, mechanism. BRICS also, they also have their own contingency liability, trying to make sure if member country have difficulties, balance payment difficulties, they will, rely on not only IMF, but also rely on their own regional and, facilities. So, and also many initiatives like, on the trade investment side. I think you know that the TPP, TTIP, regional RCEP, among many other, Asia Pacific Free Trade Agreement, a lot of these kind of discussion, right, are ongoing. And, so that all will have, and also even at the bilateral level, many countries are doing this kind of bilateral investment treaty. You heard about, what is going on in China, between China and US. They are working on this BIT also, right, very actively. A bilateral investment treaty between the number one and number two, the global economies. So all those kind of things will have an impact on the capital flow. I just gave you, that kind of pictures at global, regional, and bilateral levels. So how can we, strengthen, improve our dialogue coordination, right? On the one hand, we try to improve that capital flow, but at the same time, we try also to make sure, right, they are, are harmoniously, consistent with each other. And they can also support the global, regime, right, on the trade and investment, particularly for those regional and bilateral, initiatives. And thirdly, I want to mention that as a development bank, I see that in the region, particularly in Pacific, in Asia Pacific, many countries, particularly many developing countries, right, it's still, that needed to improve their investment climate, be easy of doing business. I see the gap here. They have made a lot of progress in many countries we saw, right? But still, how can they attract more, capitals? Not only from the West, but also from the region, right? Mr. Sinha mentioned about the regional initiative, right? But the bond market, I know that among the ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, they have been working on this. Personally, I will be involved in this also. So, but they make progress also. You see how we can make sure that the regional saving can be used, right, in a more effective way. This is something, related also regional corporate integration. In the future, we had a debate, the first session. How can we do that? Maybe later we can talk more. I can talk more about that. But I can see that, in the coming years, we see more and more countries move to the middle income, to the middle upper income in a region. They do need, that more investment, more capitals, particularly for the infrastructure financing we discussed the other day, and also for structural reform, for the human resources development, social infrastructure, among many, many others. So I see that, with the, the more capitals in the region and more, resources could be, mobilized, we will see this region will continue to be one of the very, the strong, engine of the growth. So with that, I will stop here. So, yeah.
Thank you, Wencai. So we've talked about the need for capital, the need to improve trust, etc. But if you look at we come back to what we're sort of focusing also is the politics of global capital. Maybe we can get into some of the specifics on how domestic politics is actually impacting capital flows and global cooperation in terms of bilateral agreements, the breakdown of some of the larger sort of fears. If there's anyone of you who would like to go ahead and talk about that.
I'd just like to perhaps reinforce some of the points that Chairman Sinha made about the domestic influences on the global regulatory progress. And I'd have to say I have to agree with him that while there is a fiction that all voices are equal around the table, the truth is, I think, that domestic influences do affect global standard setting. And they work in very subtle, often, and ways that are not ever articulated. But if we look at the development of global financial centers pre the GFC, and you ask yourself, did the fact that there were certain jurisdictions desperate to make themselves or their main cities global financial centers affect the failure of the regulation of the derivatives market in any sensible way? I think the answer has to be yes. And did light-handed regulation, which was one of the markers of one of the global financial centers, in order to attract more business to that global financial center, did that affect the way in which the question of the entire issue of not only over-the-counter derivatives, but derivatives generally, yes, it was, I think, quite significant. So, and sometimes there's a combination of interests around the table to stop any regulation of certain areas because it's not actually in the domestic interests of that jurisdiction. And one has to ask oneself, if you want a global standard, and frankly, it's not going to be implemented in the major jurisdictions around the world, is it truly a global standard? And this question of whether the perfect pushes out the good or how you actually work out what that standard is going to be is influenced by domestic politics.
Rohinton, do you have anything to add on?
I do. I think we should not forget domestic politics, and I'd say 3 points there. One, the quality of domestic institutions affects how well you translate domestic savings into productive investment, what's called domestic resource mobilization. And that varies a lot by country. And that's got nothing to do with the global environment and you know, whether hedge funds are moving in and out and so on. So I think every country has to take a hard look at its own domestic systems and how well, and Asia is a good example. Very high savings rates, not always translated into effective investment. So we should look at ourselves if we're Asians and then think of the international dimension. That said, 2 points about the international dimension. One, blindingly obvious, and we've raised it, domestic politics in the US is what held up IMF reform. If you believe that IMF reform is central to everything else that's going on, then that's an example to address your question, Lewis. And the third and final point I'd make about domestic politics is that the revelations of the Panama Papers had nothing to do with Panama and nothing to do with paper. It had to do with digital issues, and it had to do with the fact that there are financial havens around the world. In fact, a very good case can be made, and has been. There's a financial secrecy index in which Panama is not the number one on the list. The top 3 or 4 countries would be the US, Hong Kong, the UK. There's now a bit of a joke that, you know, we're waiting for the Delaware Papers. And so my point is that, yes, in fact, domestic politics do pertain, but let's not also forget the quality of domestic institutions.
Yeah, briefly, I actually already mentioned about something. You know, certain capital flow is mainly driven by the market, but also the politics and the policies, particularly of the government, do have a big impact on the flow. I think I see that these days many countries try to, you know, also attract more capitals, even including the developing economies also. But certainly, what kind of policy they impose on the you know, particularly for the, you know, foreign investment side, what kind of market, what sector they open to foreign investors, right? That will have a big impact. Those are issues related to the, you know, also the bilateral investment treaty kind of negotiations, you know, among many countries, or even regional agreement, right? They're negotiating. So I think that certainly will have, you know, we see the policies have a big impact there. But at the same time, I think, you know, particularly, I think Mr. Sinha mentioned about also the reserve currency, you know, countries, their policy also have a big impact, you know, because, you know, that we know that, you know, that for the big, you know, reserve currency, if they change their monetary policy, interest rate, or that also causes a lot of impact on the exchange rate, and also causes a lot of capital inflow, outflow at the global level. So I think, you know, it's something we have to manage, you know, that. So those are things, so I you know, but also, you know, that, those are things I want to say at this moment. Thank you.
Mr. Sinha, do you want to say anything?
I think so far as the domestic policies are concerned, every successive government is within its legitimate right to define and design its own policy. But so far as the question of a foreign investor is concerned, he needs 1 or 2 assurances, irrespective of the policy changes. And the first one is that there would not be any change in policy which will have an adverse effect with retrospective effect. So we have to be very mindful that whatever we do, it should not be a negative surprise for those who have invested in your country. Retrospective implementation of laws is something we should frown upon. And the second point I would like to make is that the foreign investors need equal protection of law. If there is one protection available to domestic investors, the same level of protection should be available to them. Fortunately, in India, we have moved substantially in that direction. I would like to give an example of foreign portfolio investors. And earlier, SEBI had a regulation about how much open interest a domestic investor can have in the derivative market versus how much open interest they can have for the foreign investors. That has now been made uniform. So the good development is that the law now, or the rule now, is based on the market integrity issues, the risk management issues, rather than the color of the capital or the jurisdiction or origin from where it is coming. So that's my first point. And second point, I would like to elaborate on something which I said earlier about extraterritoriality. That is something which is not being discussed in international fora or in various discussions, and I would like to highlight it once again. Let me tell you that India was one of the first countries to introduce anonymous order-driven trading on the stock exchanges. And the risk management measures that have been put in place here, they have been evaluated, for example, by IMF. And India is one of the 6 jurisdictions who have scored 8 out of 8 possible points about our system. However, and we have an exchange which is number 4 in the world in equity trading, which is number 1 in the world so far as number of derivative trades are concerned. It is number 1 in the world. And here is what we have scored 8 out of 8. Only 6 jurisdictions have come up. However, here is another regional jurisdiction which is coming out with a requirement that all the clearing corporations in India, including one under Reserve Bank, that is the CCIL, and one under, or 2 under SEBI, they will have to get a test passed by a foreign regulator. When on the one hand, you have met all the requirements of global standard setting, and you have scored 8 out of 8, how justified it is to subject them to something else? So I'd like to pose this question.
Thank you. In fact, Vaidi, who moderated the last panel, wrote a paper which Gateway House, it's available on the Gateway House website, about how India's done so much great work on the regulatory side and how developing markets can actually be lessons for the other markets to learn from you. So now I'd like to sort of talk about 2 buzzwords that are very popular today. One is governance and the second is regulator. And I sort of learned markets at Chicago, so I sort of believe a lot in it, but one of my professors, the Nobel Prize winner Stigler, coined the word regulatory capture. And so I'd like to sort of, because it's important for markets to have some regulation, but there's also the fear of regulatory capture. The second word is governance. You know, it's a buzzword, everyone talks about governance, everyone writes about it. Is it become a tick-the-box exercise and a fancy word for people to use? Because we still see problems happening across the world. So if any of you would like to talk about governance and regulators and what's needed to be happening. Ciao, Jane.
I'll talk about regulators to start. I don't think there's any perfect model for the regulator. And we see around the world combined prudential and conduct regulators, we see individual conduct and prudential regulators, we see self-regulators. And I think it's interesting that Joseph Stiglitz focuses on regulatory capture. I think that probably the most obvious example that I have seen of regulatory capture is in the self-regulatory space. And I sit on the Public Interest Oversight Board, which was set up by the IMF and the World Bank and the BIS to oversee the standard setting of international auditing standards, because they were being set by committees that were actually run by IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants. And I think that that is an issue, that there was not only a perception that there was regulatory capture, but if accountants are setting auditing standards, it does seem to me that there is a pretty clear view that they need some other oversight. But I'd just like to also talk about the Financial Stability Forum and Board, if I might. Initially, I sat as an observer in the Asia-Pacific version of the Financial Stability Forum. And I have to say, before the global financial crisis, it was a very one-eyed view by the central banking community that fundamentally this was only about banks, and financial stability had nothing to do with the capital markets. And the word shadow banking, frankly, virtually never appeared at these forums. And it was as if there was a pair of binoculars looking at the markets with a hand over one eye, and they were only looking into the Basel framework and a highly technical argument about that. While all around the world, large networked arrangements with those banks were being polluted, if you like, by some very dodgy products from the capital market side. And they were not necessarily seen as being a threat to financial stability until the dreaded moment when they were. And then suddenly they became that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I think that's an important structural issue. And I have to say that now Mark Carney has taken on the chairman of the Financial Stability Board, and that's now recognised. And I'm pleased to see India has a seat at that board, and the regulator obviously plays a role there, and IOSCO plays a role. But that, I think, has been a real blindness in the structural framework.
Yep.
I think the two concepts you mentioned, Lewis, regulatory capture, which is George Stigler, not Joe Stiglitz, and governance go together. If you're in a poor governance regime, then in fact the responses to problems may not solve the problem. And let's not pretend that just because there's a problem, there's a regulatory solution to it. If you look at capital mobility, where this plays out is in the sort of debates around the Tobin tax and sand in the wheels. I don't think we're saying every country must have sand in the wheels legislation to slow down volatile capital. What the debate should be about is, if a country had the means to be able to do so and wanted to do so, could it do so? And that's Mr. Sinha's point about countries having the autonomy to design their own internal processes. Until recently, until the IMF had its change of heart on capital account regimes, there was a sense that any kind of sand in the wheels was not a good thing, which was in fact pure politics, not even politics, ideology. Now what we're saying is, give countries the right to do that. That doesn't mean they will all necessarily exercise the right, and it doesn't mean they all should be doing it. But having a toolbox that allows you to do that in exceptional cases is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very quickly, I mentioned about this governance issue, and I mentioned about the global initiatives, and also regional one and bilateral one. I think that certainly we should try to promote this coordination, cooperation among the three layers. Global level, certainly we need to have more dialogue, coordination, try to monitor these flows. And IMF, FSB, and other G20, I think should do more this kind of dialogue and see how we can set up a system there. And regional initiative, trade, investment, negotiations, bilateral one also, right? How we make sure that they could be consistent among themselves, and also consistent with the global standard, and like Doha round, and this kind of trade liberalization, right? So so I think we needed to work on those governance structure among the three layers. But we do need the coordination, cooperation among the three layers. So that's the point. I don't see that. We have not done enough on that. We should do more on that among the three layers. Thank you.
Sinha?
You raised two very important points about regulatory capture and governance. On the issue of regulatory capture, I think the best way to approach this subject would be through the prism of accountability of that regulator. What is the mechanism set in that particular jurisdiction or country about accountability? If you have set up a regulatory framework which is independent. And independent means not only operationally independent, but also financially independent, I think you have solved a lot of the problems. Many of the cases that you may have in your mind are examples where they are not independent in terms of financial independence, and they have to depend upon the government of the day for each and everything. That is the seed for creating problems. Fortunately in India, at least the major financial sector regulators are financially independent, and it's for anybody to evaluate whether the actions taken have been of the level which can meet the best global standards. A regulator can, which is financially independent, can be incompetent, it can be inefficient, but it can, how effective it is, can be judged ideally by the parliament. My position is that a regulator should not be subjected to accountability to the government of the day. This is again a problem area. So the accountability should be with the parliament, which is the supreme in any country. If we take these 2-3 factors into account, then I think the chances of regulatory capture will be seriously minimized. On the question of governance, I think you will find, for example, and I'm talking in the case, that in matters of shareholder protection, India's rank used to be 49, I'm sorry. It used to be 49 in the year 2012 in a World Bank report, a World Bank study. It came up to 34 in the year 2013. And in the year 2014, we came up to number 8 from the top. And we maintained that in 2015 also. I'm tempted to say that in these rankings, India is ahead of many of the largest democracies or jurisdictions that you can possibly think of. Which country, for example, you can imagine where the regulator has been able to penalize not only private sector companies, but also companies owned by the government? And we have been able to do that. So this is the type of regulatory independence we have. This is the focus on governance that we have. People may be dissatisfied with what we do. Maybe we do not have capacity. Maybe we are inefficient. We are incompetent. But then if we have set the whole things in place, things will move in the right direction.
Jane, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about coming back to trust and governance, because the Integrated Reporting Council board that I'm on is actually dedicated to trying to develop sustainable inclusive capitalism, to actually have a report which articulates the business model on the short, medium and long term. It tries to address Mark Carney's tragedy of the horizons, tries to stop this very short-term speculative approach to corporate management, and therefore it goes to the heart of corporate governance. And as part of that exercise, they've set up a corporate reporting dialogue which has the full spaghetti of accounting of international standard setters, the IASB, the FASB, the SASB, the GRI, all of these people sitting in one room trying to get some at least coordination. And those of us who worked on the dreadful US GAAP IFRS challenge and failed know how hard that will be. But nevertheless, it's a very important governance initiative, and I encourage you to have a look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're now, I can see a nod over there at the back. So go ahead with questions.
Thank you. So we've been taking questions from the floor throughout the session. Please do contribute more of them. Kunal will come and pick them up if you just wave a piece of paper at him. The first ones that I have are linked very much to this issue of trust. And I think it would be interesting to hear a bit more about, from the wider panel, as to the prospects for trust to be rebuilt in what this question contributed by Rajni Bakshi is referring to at the high table of global capital. So what are the prospects for success of the IRC's project? And another question from another Gateway House scholar, Akshay Mathur, was around shadow banking, and looking at that as an example of where perhaps the eye was not focused specifically on the regulatory regime. Are you hopeful that there equally you could rebuild trust through preempting a crisis there?
So And Rohinton, would you like to talk about that?
Okay, on the first question of, I have some concerns, I think, about whether I'll start with the last one. This is really about whether the next range of issues that are likely to arise, and they'll arise, to my mind, in the area of virtual finance, and we'll be discussing that later this afternoon. But there is always the problem that regulators inevitably are solving the problems of the last crisis and not necessarily anticipating the problems of the first. So, and I think that we are still doing that. And some of the work that's being done at the moment is definitely the last crisis issues and not necessarily trying to look over or understanding enough to look over the horizon and see where the next crisis might come from. Because, and the second point I'd want to make is I wonder whether some of the responses to the last crisis have not actually pushed some of the commercial activity into the shadows or into the more opaque parts of the market. Because if you think now about the way banks are shrinking, certainly the GDP of the top 100 banks has shrunk quite significantly since the global financial crisis. And the number of IPOs that are occurring at various stock markets around the world is diminishing. It's certainly getting smaller. There are less IPOs. Where is the capital being formed? It's being formed in the private sector. It's being formed out of the spotlight of regulation, and I think that's a concern.
Thank you.
I agree with Jane that the next big thing is how blockchain technology evolves and how cryptocurrencies evolve. And so I'll be sort of listening to that session with great interest. And that is going to determine how much trust we have in the financial system, much more than anything else we're doing. That said, there is no question that the reason we have so many regional financial safety nets and so on is precisely because there's been this broken trust in the way the global central financial system and the way the IMF have resolved these issues. But these regional financial safety nets still don't have the power to bypass the IMF. So I know there's lots of grumbling around this, but when you look at the numbers of the resources in central bank swaps and in the 4 big regional financial arrangements, they're still quite small. So I think if you believe that you want to put your money where your mouth is, then I still think there's a great degree of trust in the central system. And that's a good thing, because a lack of trust in the way the financial system is regulated centrally is bad. Because if you don't have coordination between, you'll end up like you have in the trade world, where the WTO becomes much more marginal and you have the spaghetti bowl, which is helping no one actually.
So another one?
Yes. We've got a question from a team member at the Hinduja group, which is very much in the field of what is the role of new institutions and how can they play a proactive role in development. So the question is, Asia has a high savings rate through the ADB, the NDB, the AIIB. Part of the savings could be deployed in infrastructure projects. What 3 action points could be considered to retain and channel these savings within India?
What's your last point? Sorry, I missed your last sentence.
What 3 action points or what action points could be considered to retain and channel savings within India?
Okay, thank you. I think this is very important for us and MDB. And certainly you mentioned about the new development banks also, in the region. So certainly I mentioned about, that we try to help our DMC, development member country, to mobilize resources, both from outside of the region, but also in the region, right? So I think, certainly we needed to help them to improve the policy, framework, and, including the legal regulation from how getting more private sector investment, like PPP project I mentioned yesterday also. And, so how we help them to promote some structural reform, like through our policy-based loan, RTA system, right? For the, maybe SOE reform, opening maybe more sector to private sector, those kind of things. And we also help them to do like, labor training, like, vocational training, those kind of things. That can help also, attract more investment, right, from the private sector. But I think another things we need to is to try to help our region, many countries, to develop the bond market, capital market. That's what we are trying to do also, particularly for the local currency denominated bond market. We are issuing bonds in many of DMC, and we use the money to finance the project using that local currencies. That kind of things. And certainly we will try to do more. And so also we support the equity market, those kind of capital market initiatives in some of our DMC also. So a lot of things we are working on that, and and of course we also try to promote this financial cooperation, particularly in the last more than 10 years for support ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea for the financial, Asian bond market development I mentioned to you, and also, Chinmay, safeguard Chinmay initiatives also. ADB also play a role here, by providing TA, technical assistance, and others. So, we certainly will try to also look for other financial innovations, instrument to mobilize resources, like, how we make use of guarantee, credit enhancement, risk transfer, because we see that the private sector they are very keen on the infrastructure financing, but they are looking for the bankable project. That how can we really make sure that they can have the project here, and they can also that we have the instrument available for them. So I just stop here. So a lot of things we can do together with the AIB and NDB. So we are very happy to, very committed to working with the new banks. As you can see, yes, last Friday, ADB approved the first co-financing project with AIB in Pakistan for the highway project. That's a very good start. So you'll see that. We have more co-financing with them also. Thank you.
I see Mohan jumping up over here, so go ahead.
Luis,
You'll beat me up otherwise.
4 countries in the world have released $10 trillion of surplus liquidity into global markets. The United States, UK, EU, and Japan by the QE programs. Now, these QE programs are driven by domestic politics and the domestic economy of these countries. So what are we talking about? A global financial architecture and global capital. Is the global capital a myth today? Because the ability of these countries to roll this back is dependent on something which is not global. And 2, a large number of zombie companies have come up in these countries who only survive because interest rates are so low. If interest rates goes up, there's going to be huge unemployment. So I'll ask the panel their views on global capital when these things are there today. That's the reality.
Any comments? Yeah. Okay, so the consensus is you're right. We got time for one last question.
Very good.
Okay. We don't have, sorry, we'll have to come back to that later. There's a question there. Okay.
Not a question.
Okay.
I just want to add to what Mohan just said, because what you said is very important about the nature of the financial crisis that's hit us. But you consistently use the word global financial crisis. What we had in 2008, 2009 was a transatlantic financial crisis. Just as in 1997, 98, we had the Asian financial crisis. So I think once you understand that what we had was a transatlantic financial crisis, then the rest of what you said follows.
Sure. Last question.
The last question is about new institutions again, and whether or not they exist and new boundaries are being drawn. The point of view is here that, for example, the use of common global financial infrastructure for sanctions, for example, is yet another sign of the politicization of this area. And the question is around, can we really ever get away from the old structures which are used for political purposes, despite the emergence of new institutions?
I saw him shaking his head.
I think it is going to take a lot of time before the old institutions can become irrelevant. I don't see that happening in foreseeable future.
Okay.
Can I just say I'm not pessimistic that the current institutions can't be reformed, but we did try to do that to IOSCO at some stage, and we had some success. But I don't think that we should be thinking that we're going to get a situation where anything other than consensus is going to drive global standard setting. unless somehow the universal policeman appears out of somewhere, but I doubt that's going to happen.
Any last words? And then we sort of wrap up.
Just that whatever institutions we'll have will reflect the current politics. It's just that the institutions we now have reflect politics of another era, but I wouldn't be optimistic about politics ever getting out of the game. It's just a question of whether you want to keep up with your politics or not.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Thank you also. I think, because this is a good opportunity for also to mention something, one of my key things in my mind, how since we're here in India and we are in South Asia, we talk about, Asian integration in the first session. So I feel that this is, we are talking about the capital flow, not only from outside the region, but also inside the region, even from the neighboring country, right? More, even regional saving. But I think one of the important channel is to enhance our regional corporate integration. I think in South Asia, India, can and should play more, leading role, important roles in enhancing the, the regional, sub-regional cooperation. I see that in other parts of Asia, right, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and ASEAN and even Central Asia, right, GMS in many parts of Asia, a lot of progress has been made. And I do want to see more progress in the South Asia also. Particularly, among the, South Asian member countries. So really, the country can enjoy a more inter-regional trade investment, like my colleagues mentioned in the first session, right? That's what they want to say. And so I do want to say that, we certainly want to support that further through our ADB program in many parts of Asia, including our program in South Asia.
So I guess in conclusion, domestic politics will continue to impact global capital flows. And people in the financial markets, bankers, businessmen, etc., need to keep that in mind when deciding on policies and strategies, etc. And that's where Gateway House comes into play, the intersection of business and politics. Thank you, everyone, for being over here. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you to our panelists, and with that, we draw to a close the discussion on politics of global capital.